It was an ordinary afternoon in the heart of the city. The streets were lined with a cacophony of honking cars, rushing pedestrians, and street vendors selling their wares. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the sidewalks, where the heat of the day still lingered. A light breeze carried the smell of street food, the distant hum of traffic, and the subtle scent of fresh flowers from a nearby market stall. Amidst this bustling scene, there was a quiet alley that led off from the main road, often overlooked by most of the busy passers-by. It was a narrow, shadowed passageway, littered with old newspapers and forgotten trinkets. At the far end, near a small, weathered trash bin, a thick layer of grime had accumulated over the years, giving the alley a neglected and somewhat forgotten air. On this particular day, the alley seemed almost deserted, with only a few stray cats weaving between garbage bags and the occasional pedestrian who quickly passed through, eager to avoid the seemingly grimy stretch of street. The soft sound of her shoes tapping against the pavement echoed in the otherwise still air. The protagonist, a woman in her early 30s named Sarah, had been walking down this alley on her way home from work. She was tired, the weight of a long day at the office evident in her slow stride. Sarah had always taken this shortcut, not because it was faster, but because there was something about the quiet of this alley that calmed her after a hectic day. It was an odd little part of the city, untouched by the chaos around it, yet burdened with its own kind of solitude. Sarah was a woman who, despite her outward appearance of being self-sufficient and composed, felt like she had been carrying the weight of her own personal struggles. Having recently gone through a messy breakup, she found solace in the routine of her everyday life, walking through the familiar streets, finding a quiet place where she could momentarily escape her thoughts. As a marketing professional, Sarah had worked long hours, managing projects that left her mentally drained. But now, on this late afternoon, her mind was wandering far from work. She couldn't help but think of her future, uncertain and undefined. She wasn't looking for anything, just passing through as she always did. That was until she heard the faintest sound, a soft whimpering, almost imperceptible against the usual street noises. She paused, her steps slowing, unsure if her ears were deceiving her. A chill ran down her spine, the air seeming to grow colder in that moment. She turned towards the noise, eyes scanning the alley with a growing sense of confusion. At first, she thought it might be a stray animal, a cat perhaps. But as she ventured closer to the source of the sound, her eyes landed on something that made her heart stop. There, nestled among a heap of discarded trash and old newspapers, was a small bundle, no larger than a bag of groceries. It was barely visible, obscured by the pile of refuse, but the soft cries that escaped the bundle were unmistakable. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she took a hesitant step forward. Her mind raced, trying to process the sight before her. The tiny form moved slightly, the blanket around it shifting. For a split second, it almost looked like something out of a nightmare. How could a baby be here? In a trash bin, surrounded by filth and neglect? The confusion turned to panic as Sarah knelt down beside the bundle. Her hands trembled, unsure whether to reach out or turn away. Her thoughts were a blur as she slowly unwrapped the dirty cloth, revealing the baby beneath. It was a small infant, swaddled loosely, but looking utterly vulnerable and alone. The sight of such innocence in such a dire situation shocked her to her core. Her stomach twisted with a feeling she couldn't name, horror, disbelief, and an overwhelming sense of urgency all at once. She could hear the baby's whimpers growing louder, and it jolted her back to the present. What was she supposed to do? Who could do something like this? Her thoughts spun, yet her body moved on instinct. She reached for her phone, her hands shaking as she dialed for help, her voice barely above a whisper, trying to steady herself. The weight of the situation bore down on her, and for the first time in a long while, Sarah's life felt far from ordinary. What had she just discovered, and what was going to happen next? All she could do was act, but everything felt like it was moving too fast. She had no idea how much her life, and the baby's, would change in the minutes, hours, and days to come. Sarah's heart raced as she knelt down beside the baby, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The world around her seemed to slow, the noise of the city muffled, as if everything had faded into the background. She could only focus on the tiny form before her, the helplessness radiating from it like a cold, sharp knife piercing her chest. Her hands trembled uncontrollably as she reached out to touch the blanket, the soft fabric cold and slightly damp from the morning dew that had settled over it. As she slowly peeled it back, revealing the baby's fragile features, a wave of panic surged through her. The baby's wide eyes stared up at her, blinking in confusion, the tiny hands clutching weakly at the air. The baby let out a soft whimper, and Sarah's stomach churned in response. She wasn't prepared for this. No one could ever be prepared for something like this. Her mind screamed in disbelief. What kind of person would abandon a defenseless infant in such a manner? How could someone just leave a baby to be discarded like trash? The thought sent a shudder through her body, and she nearly stumbled back in horror. She wanted to scream for help, but the words caught in her throat, trapped by the overwhelming emotions of fear and confusion. The air felt thick, oppressive, as if the weight of the world was bearing down on her. But then the baby whimpered again, the sound cutting through her thoughts like a knife, reminding her of the urgency of the situation. She had to act. She had no choice but to do something, but what? The panic surged once more as she quickly grabbed her phone from her pocket, her fingers clumsy as she dialed the emergency number. Her voice, when it came, was barely a whisper, laced with fear and uncertainty. "Please, I need help. There's a baby. Someone left a baby in the trash." As the dispatcher calmly took down the information, Sarah's mind raced with 1,000 thoughts. Who could she trust? Could she even trust the authorities to get there in time? Would they treat the situation with the seriousness it required, or would bureaucracy and red tape delay the response? In the pit of her stomach, there was a gnawing fear that time was running out, and if she didn't act swiftly, it might be too late. Her mind swirled with conflicting thoughts, torn between wanting to protect the baby and the overwhelming realization that she might be putting herself in danger by getting involved. What if the baby's parents were out there somewhere, looking for it, angry at her for taking action? What if there were others involved? The unknowns piled up, suffocating her in their weight. The baby, meanwhile, seemed oblivious to the storm of emotions swirling around Sarah. Its little chest rose and fell with each shallow breath, eyes still wide with confusion, mouth slightly open as if trying to find comfort. It was a tiny thing, no more than a few months old at most, fragile and small in a way that made Sarah feel as though she might break it just by holding it. She knew she had to do something, anything, to help. But her mind was a haze of uncertainty, and the cold bite of fear made it hard to focus on what needed to be done. Was she overreacting? She had no idea, but one thing was clear: she couldn't just walk away. Not now, not when the baby needed her. As her phone call ended and the dispatcher assured her that help was on the way, Sarah turned her attention fully to the baby. It was clear that the infant was malnourished. Its skin, pale and delicate, clung tightly to its bones, and there was an odd, sickly pallor to the baby's face that worried Sarah more with every passing second. The baby's hands, though small, were stiff and thin, veins visible beneath the translucent skin. The thinness of its body, wrapped in tattered blankets that were barely enough to keep it warm, indicated a severe lack of proper care, possibly for days, maybe longer. But despite the signs of neglect, there were no obvious physical wounds on the baby, no cuts or bruises that suggested immediate physical harm. Sarah gently stroked the baby's head, her fingers trembling as she made sure to handle it as carefully as she could. The baby's hair, dark and sparse, was damp from the moisture in the air, but there was a quiet softness to its features. Its eyes were glassy, not fully focused, which only added to the sense of fragility and fear Sarah felt. The baby's breathing was shallow but steady, and Sarah couldn't tell if it was simply exhausted or if it had been deprived of the care it needed for much too long. The situation was dire, but there was still hope. It was alive. That was the most important thing. Yet, the baby's condition spoke volumes about the kind of neglect it had endured. How long had it been left here? Who could do such a thing? Sarah's heart ached, and for a moment, It was as if the world itself had tilted off its axis, leaving her helplessly suspended in a reality that made no sense. She wasn't a mother. She hadn't planned on being a protector. But in this moment, she was the baby's only hope. Sarah's hands were still trembling as she cradled the baby in her arms, unsure whether it was simply exhaustion or a growing sense of panic that made her fingers shake. She could feel the small body, cold and fragile, against her chest, and with every breath the baby took, Sarah's own pulse quickened. She couldn't do this alone. She had no idea how to help this tiny life, no medical expertise, and certainly no knowledge of how to deal with the situation. The weight of responsibility was suffocating, and the realization hit her that she needed help, and she needed it fast. Her phone felt heavy in her hand, and for a moment, she froze, unsure who to contact first. She wasn't prepared for this. She wasn't prepared for any of it. Sarah had always been self-sufficient, handling everything on her own. But this was different. She couldn't risk waiting. Her first instinct was to call emergency services. She dialed 911 with urgency, but as the phone rang, her mind raced with worry. What if they didn't get here in time? What if they questioned her, blamed her for the baby's condition? She took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. When the call was answered, she almost stumbled over her words. "Please, I found a baby in a trash bin." Sarah's voice was shaky, barely more than a whisper. "It's abandoned. It's so small and I don't know what to do. It needs help, please." The dispatcher, though calm, immediately took control of the situation. They asked for her location, details about the baby's condition, and reassured her that help was on the way. But the sound of their voice, while reassuring, did little to calm the storm inside her. Her mind spun with questions. How long had the baby been there? Was it going to be okay? What if something happened to the baby before help arrived? As Sarah hung up the call, she felt a brief sense of relief. The professionals were on their way, and that was all she could do for now. But it didn't feel like enough. She wasn't about to leave the baby alone again, not even for a second. She called her friend Jessica next, her voice urgent. Jessica was the one person she could rely on without hesitation, and Sarah needed her to be there, to talk to her and to calm her down. "Jessica, I need you to come now. There's a baby. It's been abandoned. I'm in that alley near the corner of 5th and Oak." Sarah's words tumbled out, panic creeping into her voice. "Please, hurry." Jessica's response was immediate and comforting, though Sarah could hear the concern in her voice. "I'm on my way, Sarah. Don't worry, just stay with the baby, okay? You're doing the right thing." Hearing her friend's voice helped settle Sarah's nerves, even if just a little. She knew Jessica would be there quickly, and in some way, that made her feel less alone in this overwhelming situation. But there was still so much to deal with, too much. Her eyes stayed on the baby, watching its tiny chest rise and fall, hoping desperately that the baby would survive until help arrived. The minutes felt like hours as Sarah sat there, feeling the weight of the responsibility pressing on her shoulders. Her thoughts kept spiraling. Was she doing the right thing? What if she messed up? It was then that she heard the sirens in the distance, growing louder as they approached. The sound of emergency vehicles sent a fresh wave of relief through her, but even as the sirens grew closer, she could still feel the underlying tension. Would the authorities believe her? Would they get there in time to save the baby? The call from the dispatcher had been reassuring, but now that the police were on their way, Sarah's heart raced in a new direction. It was then that the reality of the situation began to sink in even more deeply. The authorities would have to take control. But what if they were delayed? What if, in their bureaucracy, the baby didn't get the care it needed right away? Would she be blamed for not acting fast enough? Her mind spun with worries, but there was nothing more she could do except wait. As the emergency vehicles came to a stop, Sarah was relieved to see the lights flash in the alleyway, the paramedics stepping out with quick, determined movements. They rushed toward her, one of them asking her to step aside. But as they checked the baby, their expressions grew serious. She could hear the low murmur of their voices as they assessed the situation, and her heart sank. She had done everything she could, but there was no guarantee that the baby would be okay. She had hoped for a miracle, But now it was in the hands of the authorities, and all she could do was wait and pray. The authorities wasted no time once they arrived at the scene. Paramedics quickly transported the baby to the hospital, where doctors immediately began assessing the infant's condition. The police, on the other hand, began their investigation. They canvassed the neighborhood, speaking with nearby store owners, residents, and anyone who might have witnessed something unusual. The alley where Sarah had found the baby wasn't frequented by many people, but the officers asked everyone they could whether they had seen anyone acting suspiciously or anything that could provide a clue. They also spoke with Sarah, getting as much information as possible about the baby's discovery. Sarah had given them the exact location, and now they needed to gather more details to piece together the puzzle. One of the officers, a tall man with a calm demeanor, took the lead. "We're going to ask around," he explained to Sarah. "We'll see if anyone in the area has seen anything unusual or if there are any security cameras nearby. We'll start with the businesses around here and then go door to door if we have to." The methodical nature of his approach seemed to steady Sarah, even though she was still rattled. The officer was efficient and professional, and though Sarah was worried about the baby, the sense of urgency in the air was palpable. The police took Sarah's contact information and assured her that they would keep her updated. While the canvassing of the neighborhood was underway, the police also turned to social media. News of the abandoned baby spread quickly, and within hours, it was circulating across local platforms. The authorities posted pictures and descriptions of the baby, hoping someone would recognize it or have information about the parents. The post included a request for anyone with knowledge of the incident to come forward. Tips began to flood in almost immediately, though they mostly consisted of speculation or unhelpful information. Still, it was a sign that people cared, and that there was potential for leads. The investigators began sifting through the tips, trying to track down any that could lead them to the parents. It wasn't long before the police discovered a troubling pattern in the city. In the past year, there had been a small but consistent rise in the number of abandoned children found in various parts of the city, some left in public parks, others in alleyways, or even hidden in garbage bins. Each case was unique, but there were enough similarities to raise concern. In each of the cases, the infants were left alone in places where they were vulnerable, usually wrapped in old, tattered blankets, with no signs of immediate harm but showing signs of neglect. There were no immediate clues pointing to the parents, and the authorities struggled to find connections between the cases. It seemed that, in many instances, the children had been left in places where there was little chance of immediate discovery. Whether it was the same person or different people, the pattern was disturbing. Some of the babies had been older than the one Sarah found, and some were in even worse condition, malnourished or showing signs of physical trauma. It was a sad reflection of a larger, systemic problem, and the more the authorities dug, the more it seemed like an issue they hadn't been able to address, perhaps one that had been happening for much longer than anyone realized. The increase in these cases began to shed light on a troubling reality. The rise in abandonment wasn't random. It was indicative of deeper issues, like economic strain, lack of access to proper care, or perhaps even abuse. But what was truly horrifying was that the authorities were no closer to finding the parents, let alone understanding the reasons behind their desperate actions. While it was clear that the babies had been abandoned in distressing circumstances, the lack of answers left more questions in its wake. For Sarah, the sense of helplessness that had initially consumed her began to shift into something more personal. As she followed the police investigation closely, she couldn't shake the image of the baby's innocent face, the helplessness in its wide eyes, and the way it had looked up at her in that alley. She had done what she could. She had called for help, gotten the baby to safety, but the question that haunted her now was whether she could do more. What happened to the baby once the authorities took over? Would they be able to find the parents, and if so, would they be able to make a difference in the child's life? Was it right for her to let them handle it, or was there something else she could do to ensure the baby's future was secured? Driven by a growing sense of responsibility, Sarah began to take matters into her own hands. While she had been a passive observer in the initial stages, she was now determined to get more involved. She couldn't just wait for the authorities to solve everything, not when she felt so personally connected to the situation. She started to visit the places where abandoned babies had been found in the past, talking to locals, asking questions, and seeking out any new information she could gather. Sarah even reached out to social workers who were involved in the cases, trying to understand the bigger picture. What was driving the abandonment? Were the babies being abandoned because of circumstances beyond the parents' control, or was there something more sinister at play? The more Sarah researched, the more she realized that she was emotionally invested in this case, not just as a concerned bystander, but as someone who wanted to make a difference in the lives of these vulnerable children. She wasn't sure what her next steps would be, but one thing was clear: she had become far more than just the woman who found the baby in the trash. She had become a part of the story, determined to find answers, and perhaps even become part of the solution. Determined to uncover the truth behind the baby's abandonment, Sarah dove headfirst into her own investigation. The police were doing their part, but Sarah couldn't sit idly by. The baby's face haunted her thoughts, and every time she closed her eyes, she saw those helpless eyes staring up at her in the alley. There had to be something more, something that could explain why anyone would abandon a defenseless infant in such a cruel way. Her first step was to revisit the area. She retraced her steps from that day, walking down the alley where she had found the baby. Sarah had already spoken to the police, but she knew there might be more to uncover if she spoke to the people who lived and worked in the neighborhood. As she approached the shops near the alley, she noticed a few people out front, and she decided to ask them about any unusual activity in the area. One woman, an elderly shopkeeper who had lived in the area for decades, seemed reluctant to speak at first, but after a bit of coaxing, she mentioned that she had seen a young woman in the alley just a few days before Sarah found the baby. She was walking down the alley, real fast, looking kind of nervous, you know, the shopkeeper said, her eyes narrowing as she recalled the encounter. But she didn't look like she was up to no good. Just like she was in a hurry. I don't know. You get all kinds of folks passing through here, but she stuck out. Sarah pressed her for more details, but the woman didn't have much more to offer other than the fact that the woman had been wearing a large scarf that covered most of her face. Next, Sarah turned her attention to nearby security cameras. The alley itself was often overlooked, but there were a couple of businesses with surveillance systems. She managed to get access to the footage from a nearby cafe. The grainy images showed a woman, indeed wearing a scarf, walking briskly down the alley. Sarah's heart raced as she watched the footage frame by frame. The woman paused near the trash bin for a few moments, glanced around as if to make sure no one was watching, and then, just as quickly, disappeared out of view. The timestamp indicated that this was around the same time Sarah had found the baby, but the woman's identity remained unclear. She then took to social media, posting a message on local community groups and asking if anyone had information about the baby or had seen anything suspicious in the area recently. It wasn't long before she received a few tips. One woman mentioned that she had heard rumors about a young mother struggling to make ends meet, someone she knew from the local shelters. Sarah's curiosity piqued, and she decided to visit the shelter, hoping to speak to someone who might know more. At the shelter, the staff confirmed that they had indeed been helping a young woman, a woman named Mia, who had been struggling with severe financial issues and was trying to escape a bad relationship. Mia had been coming to the shelter off and on for the past few months, and although the staff had been concerned about her mental state, there had been no indication that she was capable of abandoning her own child. In fact, some of the shelter workers had described her as a devoted mother, doing what she could to take care of her baby, even when things seemed hopeless. With this new lead, Sarah began to piece together the backstory of the baby's abandonment. She learned that Mia had been in an abusive relationship for years, one that had taken a heavy toll on her mental and emotional health. Mia's partner, whom she had been living with, had recently lost his job and had become increasingly angry and violent. As Mia's financial situation worsened, she was unable to provide the care her baby needed, and with each passing day, the pressure mounted. The final straw came when she was forced to leave her home in the middle of the night, after a particularly violent argument with her partner. She sought refuge in a shelter, leaving behind everything she knew, including her child. Mia had tried desperately to hold it together, but the emotional strain had worn her down. In the end, she felt she had no other choice but to abandon her child, hoping that someone else would find the baby and take care of it. It was a tragic choice, one born out of desperation. Mia's story, while heartbreaking, also painted a picture of a woman who was ultimately trying to protect her child in the only way she thought possible, even if that meant leaving the baby in a place where it might have a chance to survive. Sarah's heart ached as she learned more about Mia's struggles. The sense of helplessness Sarah had felt when she found the baby in the alley suddenly made sense. Mia wasn't an uncaring mother. She was a victim of circumstance, trapped in a cycle of abuse and poverty that made it almost impossible to see any way out. The more Sarah learned about Mia's past, the more she realized how difficult her situation had been. Mia had lost so much in her life, and in the end, it seemed that the only thing she had left was her child. But just as Sarah thought she was beginning to understand the full picture, a twist in the investigation threw everything into turmoil. One evening, as Sarah was reviewing the social media posts once more, she received a private message. The message was short and to the point. "I know who the baby is. I can help you, but you need to meet me in person." The message came from a private account, and there were no other identifying details. Sarah's first instinct was to be cautious, but her desperation to get answers outweighed her hesitation. When they finally met, the person who approached Sarah was an older woman, with eyes that were filled with both urgency and fear. She introduced herself as June, and as the conversation unfolded, Sarah learned that June was Mia's estranged mother. June had heard about the baby's abandonment through the local news, and her heart had broken. She wanted to help, but more than anything, she wanted to protect her daughter from the consequences of her actions. June admitted that she had been in touch with Mia recently, but Mia had begged her to stay out of her life, fearing her partner's wrath. Mia's mother claimed that she had tried everything she could to get her daughter help, but Mia's pride and fear had kept her from reaching out. June was determined to keep her involvement secret, but she also knew that Sarah might be the key to reconnecting Mia with her child and getting her the help she so desperately needed. This unexpected encounter sent a surge of hope through Sarah. She now had the key to locating Mia, but it came at a price. June wanted to remain anonymous, and the risk of revealing her identity to Mia's partner was too great. In that moment, Sarah realized that the mystery of the baby's abandonment was far from over. It was just the beginning of a complicated journey, one filled with unexpected twists, hidden truths, and the ongoing battle to break the cycle of abuse and neglect. The experience of finding the baby in the alley fundamentally altered Sarah's perspective on life. Before the incident, she had lived a relatively routine life, focused primarily on her career, friends, and self-sufficiency. She had always been able to compartmentalize her emotions, keeping them separate from the demands of her busy, independent lifestyle. But when she found the baby, the world she had once known felt irrelevant, as if the foundation beneath her had shifted. Sarah was forced to confront harsh realities, the struggles of others, the vulnerability of children, and the harshness of a world where things like abandonment could happen in an instant. The discovery of the baby made her question what it meant to be a family, and whether the traditional notion of family was really what mattered most. Sarah had always assumed that family meant a strong, unbroken bond, that it was something built on shared experiences and mutual care. But in the case of the baby, she realized that families weren't always born out of ideal circumstances. Sometimes they were forged out of desperation, out of people who wanted to care but didn't have the resources to do so. The experience made her more empathetic to the struggles that individuals faced, particularly those in poverty or those trapped in cycles of abuse and neglect. It forced her to reconsider her own privilege and made her more attuned to the plight of others who might be suffering in silence. Her views on life, too, began to shift. Sarah started to feel an urgency about helping others, particularly the most vulnerable. She became more aware of the cracks in society, those invisible struggles that often went unnoticed. She began to realize that while she had been focusing on her own personal growth and achievements, there was a much larger world outside of her immediate sphere. The experience of finding the baby made her see the interconnectedness of people's lives, the ripple effects of hardship and suffering, and how every small act of kindness could make a difference. It was a wake-up call for Sarah, and she found herself questioning her priorities. Where had her energy been going all these years? What really mattered to her in the grand scheme of things? Yet, as much as the experience reshaped her perspective, it also took a significant emotional toll on Sarah. The weight of the baby's discovery had been immense, and even though she had acted quickly to get help, she couldn't escape the guilt that gnawed at her. What if she hadn't found the baby? What if it had been left too long, or worse, left to die? These thoughts circled her mind constantly. Even as she helped uncover the mystery behind the baby's abandonment, there was a lingering sense of inadequacy. Could she have done more? Was there more she could do for the child? Her empathy for the baby, and for Mia, the mother, led to an overwhelming desire to fix things, to make everything right. But fixing it was not so simple. It was emotionally exhausting to balance the desire to help with the reality that she couldn't fix everything in the world. The guilt felt suffocating at times, and the emotional weight of caring so deeply for someone else's suffering began to take its toll on her mental well-being. Sarah also found herself sacrificing pieces of her own personal life. She spent hours researching resources for abandoned children, trying to connect with organizations, and pursuing leads about the baby's parents. Her social life, once vibrant and full of plans, took a back seat. The relationships she had with friends and coworkers began to fray as Sarah became increasingly consumed by the case. She couldn't help but feel torn between the person she used to be, the independent, driven woman who had a career and a life to live, and the person she had become, someone who was deeply invested in the fate of a child she had found only days ago. The emotional toll was immense, and Sarah sometimes wondered if she was giving too much of herself. But no matter how exhausted she felt, she couldn't stop herself from continuing down this path. It felt like the right thing to do, even if it meant sacrificing her own peace of mind. Amid all the turmoil, something unexpected happened. Sarah began to form a bond with the baby, a connection that deepened with each passing day. After spending so much time thinking about the child and trying to piece together the mystery of its origins, she couldn't help but feel a sense of protectiveness. The baby was no longer just a case or a story to solve. It became a person, an innocent soul that had been abandoned and deserved a better life. Even though she was not the baby's mother, Sarah couldn't ignore the way her heart had opened up. Holding the baby in her arms made her feel needed in a way she had never felt before. It was as if the baby had given her a new purpose, and for the first time in a long while, Sarah didn't feel so alone. It was a quiet, tender bond, one that transcended words, but it was real. The baby's presence in her life filled a gap that Sarah didn't even realize existed. Through the experience, she had transformed, and the baby had unknowingly become the catalyst for a new chapter in her life, one filled with more empathy, more love, and more understanding of what truly mattered. As Sarah continued her journey to help the abandoned baby, she quickly realized that while her emotional investment in the child was clear, the legal complexities surrounding the situation were far more complicated. In the days following the baby's discovery, as authorities got involved, Sarah found herself increasingly caught in a web of legal and procedural issues. The question of who would gain custody of the baby became one of the most pressing concerns. Although Sarah had formed a strong emotional bond with the baby, she knew that, in the eyes of the law, she was not the child's legal guardian, and her role in the child's future was uncertain. The legal process surrounding custody and adoption was intricate and governed by a strict set of rules. Child Protective Services, CPS, were the first to get involved, as their primary role was to ensure the well-being and safety of children in need. Sarah was advised to cooperate with CPS, as the agency would be responsible for investigating the baby's circumstances and deciding whether the child could safely be placed with any family members or in foster care. For a while, it seemed like the most likely outcome would be that the baby would remain in foster care, possibly for an extended period, until a more permanent solution could be found. However, the situation was made more complicated by the lack of any immediate family members willing or able to take custody. Mia, the biological mother, had essentially abandoned the child, and it was unclear whether she would be able to regain custody in the future, given her circumstances. On top of that, her partner's involvement in the case was also murky. With no immediate family stepping forward, Sarah began to consider the possibility of fostering the baby herself, especially as she felt more and more protective of the infant. But she also knew that fostering a child wasn't a simple matter. It would require extensive background checks, home evaluations, and approval from CPS. Sarah, though well-meaning, had never intended to be a foster parent. Her life, career, and personal circumstances had never aligned with the prospect of taking on the responsibility of a child, let alone a baby who had been abandoned. The question of adoption was another challenge altogether. In order to adopt, Sarah would need to go through the proper legal channels, including proving her ability to provide a stable, safe home for the child. She would also need to wait for the court's decision regarding the parental rights of the biological parents, which could take months or even years. The most immediate complication was that Mia, the biological mother, still had legal parental rights, even though she had abandoned the baby. While the courts could potentially terminate parental rights if it was determined that Mia was unfit, the process could be lengthy and emotionally charged. Additionally, the possibility of Mia coming forward to reclaim her child added another layer of uncertainty. What if Mia, after receiving help, decided that she wanted to reunite with her baby? The legal battle that would follow could tear the child from Sarah's life just as quickly as it had entered it. Sarah was also forced to consider the involvement of other extended family members, such as Mia's estranged mother, June. If June decided to step forward to take responsibility for the child, it could create even more legal complications. The courts would have to determine whether June was a fit guardian and whether Sarah had any legal claim to the child. The complex nature of the child's legal status left Sarah feeling more like an outsider than a potential parent. Even though she had already done so much to help the baby, the question of whether she would be allowed to keep the child loomed large, and it felt as though she had little control over the outcome. At the same time, Sarah couldn't ignore the ethical dilemmas that were beginning to surface. As much as she felt a deep connection to the baby and a strong desire to protect and care for the child, she knew that pursuing adoption might not be the right thing to do. There was a moral line she felt hesitant to cross. The fact that the baby had biological parents, even though they were currently unfit to care for the child, complicated matters. Was it fair to intervene in a family's life in such a profound way? Sarah had already witnessed the devastating impact of Mia's struggles, and she knew that there was a family dynamic at play here, one that involved pain, hardship, and deep emotional scars. If Mia eventually turned her life around and wanted her baby back, would Sarah be prepared to let go? What if taking the child from Mia or her family created even more trauma for the baby? These questions weighed heavily on Sarah's conscience. She found herself torn between her overwhelming desire to provide a loving, stable home for the child and her awareness of the ethical implications of stepping into a family's broken dynamic. Was she, in some ways, crossing a line by pursuing adoption? Did she have the right to take the baby away from its biological mother, even if the mother was currently incapable of providing proper care? The more Sarah thought about it, the more complex the situation became, and she began to question her motives. Was her desire to help the baby truly altruistic, or was it driven by her own need for purpose and connection? As Sarah navigated these moral dilemmas, she also had to face the potential risks of her involvement. There was always the chance that her actions could upset Mia and her family, especially if Mia decided she wanted to reclaim the baby. This could lead to a lengthy legal battle, with Sarah as the central figure. On top of that, Sarah knew that there would likely be significant backlash from people who believed that she was overstepping her bounds. As a woman with no legal claim to the child, she could be seen as someone trying to take a child away from its biological parents. That could lead to legal repercussions, and in the worst case, she could face charges of kidnapping or interference in family matters. There was also the possibility that by taking action, Sarah would inadvertently make the situation worse for the child, especially if her involvement caused a rift in the family. If Mia had family members who wanted to be involved in the child's life, Sarah's actions could be seen as a threat to the family's rights. The entire process of trying to do the right thing had become far more complicated than Sarah had anticipated, and with each decision she made, the risks seemed to grow. In the end, after a lengthy and emotionally exhausting process, the baby was placed in a safe environment. The decision came after much deliberation by the courts, child protective services, and social workers who had carefully examined the case. While the legal battle was intense, and the potential for Mia to regain custody was always in the background, the court ultimately determined that the baby needed a stable home in the interim. After months of careful investigation and reassessment of Mia's ability to care for her child, the decision was made to place the baby in foster care temporarily, while Mia underwent rehabilitation to address her personal struggles. Mia's journey was a long and challenging one. She had, at first, been resistant to the idea of accepting help, overwhelmed by guilt and shame. However, after months of therapy and support from her estranged mother, June, and other community resources, Mia began to regain a sense of stability and hope. She worked hard to address the issues that had contributed to her abandoning her baby in the first place: her abusive relationship, her financial instability, and the mental health struggles that had held her back. The process was slow, but as time passed, Mia showed signs of improvement and a genuine commitment to rebuilding her life. Eventually, with the court's approval, the baby was returned to her, under the condition that she continued with her rehabilitation. The reunion, while emotional, was bittersweet for Sarah. She had been a constant in the baby's life for months, and she had grown to care for the child deeply. The day the baby was returned to Mia was filled with a mixture of hope for the future and sadness for the bond that Sarah had developed with the infant. As Sarah handed the child back to Mia, she felt a sense of relief that the baby would be in the hands of its mother, but it was also clear to her that the journey had taken a profound toll. The baby's safety and well-being were the priority, and Sarah understood that, even though it was difficult to let go, she had done everything she could to ensure a better future for the child. Sarah's final decision, though, wasn't as clear-cut as simply moving on. She had invested so much emotionally in the case, and the experience had reshaped her entire worldview. Despite knowing that the baby would no longer be in her care, she wasn't ready to walk away entirely. Sarah decided to maintain a relationship with Mia and the baby, offering support when needed and keeping the door open for future connections. Her decision wasn't without complications, as the tension between her desire to help and the need to respect the family's boundaries was difficult to navigate. However, she knew that continuing a friendship with Mia and offering occasional support would give her peace of mind, knowing that she had played a part in ensuring a better future for the baby. For now, Sarah stepped back from the direct role of mothering the baby, but she remained involved in the child's life in small ways. She kept in touch with Mia, checking in on her progress and offering help whenever possible. It was a delicate balance, but one that felt right for Sarah. She had gained a deeper understanding of the complexities of family, love, and responsibility, and while the baby was no longer in her care, she had grown in ways she hadn't anticipated. This was the new beginning Sarah had longed for, a beginning rooted in compassion, personal growth, and an unwavering commitment to doing what was right. As Sarah sat quietly, reflecting on the journey she had undertaken, she couldn't help but acknowledge the profound emotional, social, and personal growth she had experienced. Before discovering the baby, her life had been centered around her career, her independence, and maintaining control over her emotions. She had always believed in self-sufficiency and the notion that one could face life's challenges alone. However, the discovery of the baby and the subsequent emotional whirlwind that followed shattered that belief. It had pushed her to confront her vulnerabilities, to feel deeply for another person in a way she never had before. The process had been painful and transformative. Sarah had faced guilt, fear, anger, and uncertainty, emotions that were foreign to her in such an intense way. But with each passing day, she learned how to let go of control, to surrender to the unknown, and to act from a place of compassion rather than logic alone. She learned that being strong didn't mean shutting herself off from others, but instead being open to vulnerability and connection. This discovery of her own emotional depth helped her forge stronger relationships with those around her, especially her family and friends, who had witnessed her growth throughout the ordeal. Socially, Sarah's views on community and the interconnectedness of people had deepened. The support from strangers, neighbors, and even child protective services had opened her eyes to the power of collective action. She realized that no one truly lives in isolation, and when people come together, incredible changes can happen, as it did for the baby. She was no longer just a passive observer of the world, but someone who actively engaged in helping others, someone who had learned the importance of relying on and being a part of a community. On a personal level, Sarah had rediscovered her own sense of purpose. The journey, despite its many challenges, had given her a new direction in life, one that was centered on compassion and the idea that we all have a role to play in making the world better for those who are vulnerable. The lessons Sarah learned from this experience were ones that went far beyond the specific case of the baby. They were universal truths about humanity, about the importance of empathy, the impact of small actions, and the potential for healing within every community. Abandonment and hardship could leave deep scars, but with love, support, and understanding, there was always room for redemption and hope. Sarah had come to realize that even in the darkest of circumstances, there was always light, always a chance for growth, for second chances, and for healing.